Well, thank you very much for asking me to do this interview. It's really a pleasure. My name is Zbigniew Wojnowski. I'm an associate professor at Nazarbayev University in Astana, Kazakhstan. But right now I'm on a research fellowship at the University of Hokkaido in Japan. I'm a historian of 20th century Ukraine, a historian of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And my book, entitled The Near Abroad, Socialist Eastern Europe and Soviet Patriotism in Ukraine, will be published by the University of Toronto Press in the next few weeks, in May or June 2017. The book arises out of many years of research, and it's basically trying to answer the question of what people meant when they said they were Soviet in Ukraine during the 20th century, and what they meant when they rejected Soviet identities. I try to examine the meanings of Sovietness in Ukraine by looking not only at Ukraine's relationship to Moscow, but also at Ukraine's relationship with its Western neighbours, especially Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. I think this relationship with the Western neighbours is really crucial to understanding how people imagined who they were and where their place was between Russia and Europe. So that's what the book is about. The book starts in 1956, which is a really exciting time in Soviet Ukraine because Stalin had just died a few years beforehand, and Khrushchev famously delivers his secret speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, in which, for the first time, he criticizes certain aspects of the Stalinist system. In this atmosphere, it is far from clear what it means to be Soviet. People begin to argue both about the Stalinist past and about the post-Stalinist future. And very soon, just a few months after Khrushchev's shocking speech, major unrest breaks out in Eastern Europe. First, strikes break out in Poland, and the Soviet army comes very close to invading Poland. And in Ukraine, people are really talking about this because they are right on the border, and the preparations for such an invasion are very obvious to anyone who lives in Ukraine. And then in the autumn of 1956, the Soviet army actually invades Hungary. And once again, the Ukrainians find themselves on the, well, not quite the front lines, but very near to the fighting. And these dramatic events in Eastern Europe raise very troubling questions about the direction that Khrushchev is taking after the death of Stalin. People begin to really question whether reform is possible without inducing instability, without inducing violence. Some people begin to point to the reforms that are undertaken in Poland and in Hungary to suggest that perhaps the Soviet system itself should be reformed in a similar fashion. So, inspired by both Khrushchev's criticism of Stalin and by the dramatic events in Eastern Europe, people really begin to argue about where the country is heading and what the Soviet Union and what Soviet Ukraine should be. So to find out how inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine observed and interacted with their Western neighbors was definitely a very difficult task. And the easiest thing to do was to find out what they learned about their Western neighbors from official Soviet media. And so I examined newspapers, I examined both Soviet newspapers and East European newspapers that were available in Soviet Ukraine just to get a picture of what the propaganda was at the time. It was also quite easy to get a dissent because dissidents produced samizdat or samvidat publications, and I could see what dissent consisted of, what its claims were, and in some cases I could also see how dissidents assessed the state of more popular opinion. But what was really challenging was to learn how inhabitants of Ukraine who were not dissidents, who were not publishing in the underground sphere, how they interacted with their Western neighbors. And here I looked at what they said in some very heavily controlled public context. So I looked at transcripts of public meetings. I looked at KGB reports of conversations that were intercepted in various unofficial contexts, let's say on a bus or on a train, I looked at many reports from foreign travel, both produced by Poles and by Soviet Ukrainians. So I looked at what happened when an inhabitant of Lviv crossed the border and went to Rzeszów, according to his Polish hosts, and what happened during that trip, according to him, when he returned home and filed a report from that trip. I looked at accounts of encounters between Soviet Ukrainians and their Western neighbors at universities. So all of these sources are very problematic. They are all defined by the context in which they were produced, but they reveal very distinct patterns of response to what was happening in Eastern Europe among Soviet citizens in Ukraine. And I think I'm not able to say exactly what people thought in the depths of their heart. I am not able to get at what they said in the privacy of their own homes. But I can tell you that in Soviet Ukraine's public culture, in what they said in these more open contexts, including unofficial contexts, there were definitely very deep divisions in Soviet Ukrainian society. And I think those divisions are fascinating and they offer the key to understanding modern Ukraine. Following the upheavals of 1956, which is what my first chapter is about, some inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine begin to believe that the Soviet system is about to collapse because they see so much change around them and because they see that the Hungarians and the Poles are breaking away from Moscow's control. They grow to believe that Ukraine itself is about to break out of the Soviet Union. These people are in a minority. They, I would say, are extremists by the standard of their time. They tend to believe that World War III is about to break out. They begin to prepare to fight in World War III against Russian rule in Ukraine. Much more common, however, is the belief that the Soviet system is not going to collapse, but that it's going to reform. People begin to express criticism of Khrushchev's policy, saying we should copy the kinds of reforms that we see implemented in fellow socialist countries just across our western border. At the same time as expressing these sentiments, calling for the relaxation of censorship, calling for more rights for the Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian language in the USSR, these people express a sense of loyalty to the Soviet state and its institutions. They believe that change can be achieved within the USSR. And a third major group of people who react to the upheavals of 1956 are actually terrified by what's happening. They believe that Khrushchev has gone too far in criticizing Stalin, that Khrushchev's leniency has led to war and instability, and they therefore begin to call for the reimposition of some of the Stalinist controls that Khrushchev had gotten rid of. So we see major breaks occurring, not only between the USSR and its satellite states in Eastern Europe, but also between different groups in Soviet Ukrainian society. So my chapter 1 describes these kinds of conflicts, and it shows that Ukraine in 1956 is a very conflicted place. In chapter 2, I examine how the Soviet leadership tries to deal with the legacy of these conflicts. Having quashed the Hungarian uprising in 1956, Khrushchev in Moscow, but also the Ukrainian authorities in Kiev, begin to promote new types of contacts between the USSR and especially its western borderlands, including Soviet Ukraine, and the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe. These contacts include exchanges of journalists who are now encouraged to travel from Soviet Ukraine across the border to Hungary, to Poland, and to write about the building of socialism, quote unquote, in those countries. These new types of contacts include tourism, which becomes more and more accessible. Under Stalin, the Soviet border with Eastern Europe is very difficult, if not impossible, but very difficult to cross. In the late 1950s and the early 1960s, more and more people begin to cross that border. And for the Soviet authorities, this is an attempt to heal the wounds of 1956 and to demonstrate to inhabitants of Ukraine that socialism is working and that age-old ethnic conflicts, conflicts between the USSR and its satellite states can be fixed by really trying to implement the socialist system. These attempts are largely a failure. Very soon, smuggling becomes a problem. Very soon, national tensions come to the fore when tourists from Soviet Ukraine meet their Western neighbors from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, or Hungary. And by the late 1960s, the Soviet authorities are beginning to really question whether this attempt to promote a new type of internationalist identity, to overshadow the importance of state borders and ethnic identities, is really the way to go. And this is where my chapter 2, my second chapter, ends. In chapter 3 of the book, I deal with the Prague Spring of 1968, which is an attempt to reform the socialist system in Czechoslovakia. The Czechoslovak leadership in the first half of 1968 is relaxing censorship, is making it easier for its citizens to travel abroad, it's opening its borders with Western Germany. The Czechoslovak leadership emphasizes that these reforms are not anti-socialist. They claim that these reforms are an attempt to create socialism with a human face. At the beginning, the Soviet authorities are prepared to tolerate what's going on in Czechoslovakia, but by the summer of 1968, developments there go much further than Brezhnev and the Soviet leadership, including especially the Ukrainian leadership under Petro Shelest, is prepared to tolerate. This leads to the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia and the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 1968. This event really troubles the Soviet leadership in Moscow, the Soviet leadership in Ukraine, and citizens of Ukraine who are observing these developments, once again fearing that a major war is about to break out. For many people, the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia is proof that Soviet power in Eastern Europe is based on the threat of force. It is a painful and very poignant reminder of the continuing importance of national divisions and state borders under socialism. In other words, the Prague Spring turns popular attention to what makes the USSR distinct from its socialist states across the border, from its socialist satellites across the border. These states are socialist. The Czechoslovak leadership is saying, we are not going against socialism. We are trying to fix socialism. And citizens in Ukraine are very aware of that because they're watching Czechoslovak television, they are reading Czechoslovak newspapers. And yet clearly, these states are very different from the Soviet Union itself, to the point where the Soviet Union actually has to invade Czechoslovakia. So socialism, it becomes very clear in 1968 that socialism is not a sufficient indicator, it's not a sufficient marker of Sovietness. This is why inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine begin to question what it means to be Soviet in new ways. If to be Soviet is not simply to be socialist, then what is it? The answer that the Soviet leadership provide is to be Soviet in Ukraine is to be Ukrainian, and to be Ukrainian is to be Soviet. In other words, rather than trying to claim that socialism is an ideology that unites the USSR and its satellite states in Eastern Europe, the Soviet leadership begins to really emphasize the importance of ethnic divisions. And it tries to build its citizens' loyalty by playing up a sense of nationalism defined in opposition to the Eastern European states bordering on Ukraine. So my fourth chapter, which deals with the legacies of the Prague Spring, shows how Ukrainian history, Ukrainian language, Ukrainian customs and traditions are mobilized by the Soviet state in the 1970s in order to both differentiate Soviet citizens in Ukraine from their troublesome Western neighbors and to provide an answer to that question of what it means to be Soviet. If it's not about socialism, it is about ethnic belonging. So I show that in the 1970s, Ukrainian culture is, of course, subject to attacks. Certain forms of Ukrainianness are not permitted in the Soviet state. But in confrontation, in dialogue with Eastern Europe, to be Soviet means to be Ukrainian, and to be Ukrainian means to be Soviet. And finally, in my 5th chapter, I discuss how these Soviet Ukrainian identities that combine both Sovietness and Ukrainianness in them, are mobilized by citizens of the USSR to actually challenge the state. The consequences of the emergence of this new type of identity are very surprising for the Soviet leadership, because people, in describing themselves as loyal Soviet Ukrainians, begin to criticize the state. They criticize the state for not providing enough avenues for the expression of Ukrainian culture. They begin to criticize the Soviet state for not supplying Soviet Ukraine shops with enough products. They begin to criticize Soviet foreign policy. They say, if Sovietness is about representing the interests of the Ukrainian people, then why are we sending so much foreign aid across the border when we ourselves are fairly poor? In other words, Soviet patriotism, defined in these ethnic Ukrainian terms, becomes a real challenge to the Soviet state. What it means to be Soviet from the perspective of the state and what it means to be Soviet from the perspective of its citizens is not the same. In the epilogue to my book, I deal with the legacies of this identity politics in modern-day Ukraine. And I show that the history of Soviet identity building in Ukraine and the history of Soviet Ukraine's relationship with its Western neighbors is really crucial to understanding the divisions within Ukraine today, the divisions that became so evident during the Maidan. And these identities are also very important for understanding the relationship between Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe today. Let me tell you why this book is important by describing my last archival trip to Ukraine when I was collecting some of the last materials that I needed for this book. I went to Ukraine in March 2014. This was, of course, a very unstable time in the country. The disgraced President Yanukovych had already fled to Russia. The shootings of the Maidan activists had only happened about 2 weeks prior to my visit, and Kiev was still buzzing with political activity. The Maidan and Khrushev were lined with tents. But I traveled to Donetsk, where things were only just beginning to heat up. It was before the war, before the Russian invasion of the Donbass, but the situation was already quite unstable. I arrived in Donetsk on the 8th of March, and I witnessed several large demonstrations in the streets of the city. The biggest one, by far, was taking place in front of the Lenin monument in the center of Donetsk. People chanting "the Soviet Union is our homeland" were standing in front of the monument. They were waving Russian flags, but equally they were waving Soviet flags. Rumor had it that some of the participants in this protest had been shipped in from Russia overnight. But Ukraine's fragile borders, both cultural and literal state borders, really made it difficult to distinguish locals from visitors from Russia. Divisions amongst this crowd that I saw by the Lenin monument very quickly came to the surface. There was a little stage by the Lenin monument and people were fighting over the microphone. Some of them were saying the Donbass should be a part of Russia. Some of them were saying we need to remain part of Ukraine, but we need more autonomy. Some of them were self-identified Ukrainians who were saying, I was born in the Soviet Union and I'm a Ukrainian and I'm also a patriot of the Soviet Union. Others were self-identified ethnic Russians. What united all these people was common memories of their Soviet past, very positive perceptions of the Soviet Union and the social welfare system that it was associated with, and very negative perceptions of the West. They all claimed that if Ukraine joins the European Union, the West will turn them into slaves. This was echoing Soviet-era propaganda, which basically claimed that Germany especially, but also America, was waiting for the first opportunity to turn Ukrainians and Russians into slaves. Ukraine's Western neighbours, who had joined the European Union a few years before that, provided a very important point of reference for the people that I met in Donetsk on that very cold morning in March. People claimed that Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania had all suffered from joining the European Union, that they have all come to be exploited by Western Europe. And I tried to argue against them because I do not believe that is the case, but it was very difficult to get through certain stereotypes that people had learned had learned back in the Soviet days. They believed that joining the European Union had resulted in massive outflow of Poles out of Poland to work in Western Europe in jobs that were not necessarily in line with the education they had received. They believed that Poland or Romania joining the European Union opened themselves to Western investors who destroyed local businesses. They believed that the heavy industry that was still so important to the economy of the Donbass had to close down because of the requirements of the European Union imposed on the countries of Eastern Europe that joined it. So they had a very negative perception both of the European Union and of the effect that it had on the former socialist states of Eastern Europe. Now, this was one protest. There was a much smaller protest occurring a few streets down. That was a pro-Maidan, pro-European Union protest where people were waving the Ukrainian flags and they were demonstrating their support for the Donbass remaining a part of Ukraine. And once again, in that protest, Ukraine's Western neighbors were a very important point of reference. And here, the story was the exact opposite, that the European Union brings democratization and progress, that it brings economic prosperity. And once again, people were citing the example of Hungary, Romania, Poland, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, but to prove the exact opposite point. Now, in my book, I trace the history of these kinds of identities and these kinds of debates. I look at how and why people who lived in Soviet Ukraine imagined what life was like in the East and in the West. I look at the ways in which inhabitants of Ukraine spoke about their position between Russia and Eastern Europe. Just as the protesters in Donetsk in 2014, citizens of the USSR very closely observed what was happening across their western border. They read about it in the press, but they also heard about what was happening across the border on foreign radio stations broadcasting in Russian and Ukrainian. They met tourists from Eastern Europe who were traveling in Ukraine, and they themselves traveled as tourists to Eastern Europe. They observed major periods of upheaval in 1956, in 1968, and then again in the 1980s. They went to Eastern Europe as soldiers. In other words, they had many opportunities to learn about what was happening across the border in the socialist satellite states of the Soviet Union. They knew much more about those countries than they did about the capitalist West. And that is why those countries provided a very important point of reference for people debating what it meant to be Soviet, what it meant to be Soviet Ukrainian, and what the Soviet Union and what Soviet Ukraine should be. Well, the project was born in a very different time, and I was much younger when I started working on it. Around 2005, I was thinking of a PhD topic. And this was very soon after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, which made me realize that I knew very little about this huge country right next to mine. I come from Poland, but I knew very little about Ukraine. I knew that I had some Ukrainian ancestors. My great-grandmother was Ukrainian, but this was not something that my grandparents really spoke about very much. In my grandparents' generation, very strong anti-Ukrainian stereotypes were the norm. But for me, that only really raised my curiosity. This made me very interested in the relationship between Ukrainians and the Poles, and the relationship between Ukraine and Eastern Europe, maybe more broadly. All I knew about was really the wartime history that has been written about much more, the history of violent ethnic cleansing campaigns and the post-war population exchanges. But I couldn't really find much information about what happened after. What happened in the second half of the 20th century to the relationship between Ukraine and its Western neighbors. So that was one thing that really inspired me to write this book. What inspired me to write this book was also a certain degree of naivety and perhaps arrogance. My own country, Poland, had just joined the European Union when I was starting this project, and I believed that it was only going to become ever more liberal and ever more closely integrated into European structures. Now, this sense of certainty has disappeared, and I think writing a book actually makes you less certain about the world around you than you would be otherwise. I believed that the Orange Revolution in Ukraine was a sort of delayed 1989. I thought that just as former Soviet satellite states had undertaken a major project of reform in 1989, Ukraine was entering on that same path 15 years later. And what I wanted to write at first was a history of how major protest movements in Eastern Europe, how the rise of dissent in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, in Poland, how these factors influenced Ukrainians. I wanted to see what people in Soviet Ukraine thought about these opposition movements and what inspired them perhaps to follow those movements in Eastern Europe. When I started doing my research, I had to revise almost all of these assumptions. I found that the opposition movements, anti-Soviet opposition movements in Eastern Europe were very rarely seen as a positive example to follow in Soviet Ukraine. Much more often, they were seen as a threat to Soviet Ukraine's territorial integrity. They were seen as a threat to the economic prosperity of the socialist camp. I found that Soviet citizens, when commenting on what was happening in Eastern Europe in both very official contexts like propaganda and agitation meetings, but also in less official contexts, let's say lines outside shops or on public transport, people very often distance themselves from dissent and mass opposition across their western border. Having said that, they were very critical of the Soviet state. They complained about censorship, they complained about shortages, they complained about the nature of Soviet foreign policy. But these complaints, for the most part, were underpinned by a strong sense of loyalty to the Soviet state and its institutions. What I found most surprising was that people who very strongly identified with Ukraine and the Ukrainian language and the Ukrainian culture, inhabitants of Western Ukraine, who we often think were the most anti-Soviet, they, in confrontation and in dialogue with Eastern Europe, tended to be the most outspoken Soviet patriots. They would say that they had very negative memories of Polish rule in the region, or of Czechoslovak or Hungarian rule in the region. What I expected to find was that self-identified Ukrainians, people who cared about the Ukrainian language and culture, would be inspired by the example of national oppositions to Soviet rule in Eastern Europe. I thought people would say, well, if the Poles can have more autonomy from Moscow, then why can't we? if Hungary can be at least nominally independent from Moscow, why can't Ukraine also be independent from Moscow? But this is not what I found. What I found instead was that inhabitants of Western Ukraine, often Ukrainian-speaking inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine, spoke about the need to preserve the Soviet state because they were convinced that Eastern Europeans would take the first opportunity to come back and reclaim Lviv, or would take the first opportunity to come back and reclaim Transcarpathia. And this fear of East European nationalism and this conviction that Eastern Europeans were anti-Ukrainian made them quite loyal Soviet citizens. They believed that the Soviet state was a necessary protection for Lviv to remain Ukrainian, for Uzhhorod to remain Ukrainian. I found, to my surprise, that citizens of the Soviet Union, when traveling across the border to Eastern Europe, would complain to the Soviet authorities that they were forced to speak the Russian language in Poland and not Ukrainian because the Poles harbored so many anti-Ukrainian feelings. And they described this practice of forcing them to speak Russian as anti-Soviet. So they said the Poles don't like us because we are Ukrainian, therefore the Poles are anti-Soviet. Do you see what I mean? In this sense, this Soviet patriotism was expressed through the means of the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture. People describe themselves as both Soviet and Ukrainian at the same time, especially when confronted with their Western neighbors. So we tend to think of Ukraine as subject to Russification. We tend to think of Ukraine as an unequal partner in the Soviet Union. And this is true. If we look at what's happening in the USSR itself, Russification is very strong in the 1970s. If we look at dynamics within the USSR itself, Kiev, of course, has much less power politically than Moscow. But when we look at the transnational interactions, when we look at how citizens of Ukraine are interacting with people who live across the Soviet border, a very different picture emerges. In those contexts, Sovietness and Ukrainianness are synonymous. You've named, you're talking about representatives of the creative intelligentsia and the academic intelligentsia. And of course I have found in Western Ukraine very strong anti-Soviet feelings. I have found expressions of support for anti-Soviet opposition movements or dissent in Eastern Europe. This existed especially amongst the creative intelligentsia, amongst university students, and I would say was quite limited outside those circles. So to examine what people's opinions and attitudes towards the Soviet Union and toward the Soviet satellite states were, I did not conduct interviews. I looked at sources produced at the time, between the 1950s and the 1980s, and I looked at what people said in very different contexts. Of course, I looked at public statements. I looked at what people said at very heavily controlled public meetings. And needless to say, people would be controlling what they say in those contexts. They would not say in a public meeting at a factory floor or at a collective farm what they would say in the privacy of their own homes. But apart from these kinds of sources, I've also examined what people said when they thought they were not being heard. The KGB monitored popular opinion in Soviet Ukraine, especially at times of crisis. And they registered a very wide range of opinions in such public spaces as public transport, marketplaces, queues outside shops. And the opinions that the KGB register in those contexts are really surprising. They reveal that even there, where people, well, they're not at home, but they are not participating in any official meeting, even there, people express opinion that the KGB itself finds surprising. In the early 1980s, for instance, the KGB in Lviv is actually tasked with finding dissent. They are going to student halls of residence. They are traveling on buses back and forth across the city, and their bosses are expecting them to report that some people, at least, some of these supposedly unreliable Soviet citizens in Western Ukraine are expressing support for the solidarity movement in Poland. But these KGB officers find themselves in quite a difficult position because they have to report back that they found very little problems. They found very few problems. So I was surprised. I expected to find a very different picture. But equally, the Soviet leadership at the time was surprised. They expected there to be trouble, and they found a much more loyal population. What I found was that both in 1956, during the Hungarian uprising, and then again following the Warsaw Pact's invasion of Czechoslovakia, there are small but active and very vocal groups of Ukrainians in the Western borderlands in particular who believe that the unrest in Eastern Europe will spread to Ukraine and will provide a spark for the outbreak of a major war that will lead to Ukrainian independence. Some people express these views in private conversations that are intercepted by the KGB. Some people go further and even begin to dig trenches in the woods in preparation for a seemingly impending war. The Soviet state is ruthless in dealing with these kinds of views. Arrests, repressions, invigilation are the norm. The very fact that we know so much about these people results from the fact that the KGB is monitoring what they are doing. The KGB is listening in on their phone conversations. They are following them and reporting on their every move. In other words, these people who tend to be, at least according to the KGB, former members of the OUN, they have very little room to maneuver, which explains also, of course, why they are such a small group ultimately. The Soviet state, I think, is effective in eliminating these views, not only from public discourse, but also from more unofficial context, because people are simply afraid to say these sorts of things. I think what's more interesting, perhaps, is a history of what I call in the book reformist patriotism, Soviet reformist patriotism. This is a set of views expressed mostly by young people and mostly by well-educated people who, inspired by what they see in Eastern Europe, for instance, inspired by the relaxation of censorship in Poland or the introduction of certain elements of the market economy in Hungary, they begin to call for similar changes in the USSR itself. These people do not see themselves, they do not portray themselves as being anti-Soviet. They never question the territorial integrity of the Soviet Union, and yet they pose quite a challenge to the Soviet authorities. Often this challenge is framed in Ukrainian terms. So these reformist Soviet patriots, as I call them, they begin to complain about the Russification of Ukraine. They begin to complain very vocally about the fact that more opportunities are given to the Greek Catholic Church in Czechoslovakia at a time when the Greek Catholic Church is still outlawed in the USSR itself. So they begin to voice very far-reaching criticism of Soviet policy, and including Soviet policy towards Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian institutions, and yet they present themselves as loyal citizens because they say, look, the people doing these things are your allies. These are fellow socialist countries that are pursuing these policies, so how could we possibly be anti-Soviet or anti-socialist in trying to copy these socialist countries across the border? And in 1956, these kinds of views are actually quite widespread, and the authorities tolerate some of them, and they can even be expressed in very public contexts, such as agitation meetings. By 1968, following the Prague Spring, which really convinces the Soviet authorities that attempts to reform Soviet-style regimes are dangerous and lead to instability. By 1968, these kinds of views, this kind of Soviet reformist patriotism, is confined to the sphere of dissent. And it's illegal, and people expressing similar views are facing a whole range of repressions in the late 1960s, in the 1970s, and in the 1980s. So I think here we see a more complex story, because we see a larger group of people who define themselves both as loyal patriots of the Soviet Union and as critics of Soviet policy, who are at first, in the first few years after Stalin's death, tolerated by the Soviet authorities, and who increasingly come under attack after 1968. I never expected that Soviet patriotism could be seen as a challenge by the Soviet authorities themselves. I thought once citizens talk about their loyalty to the Soviet homeland, they would be seen simply as loyal Soviet citizens. But I found quite a different picture. Not only these reformist patriots that I've already talked about, but also other citizens that I call conservative patriots, who talked about how proud they were about Soviet achievements during the Second World War, who supported Soviet military interventions in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, who in no uncertain terms condemned anti-Soviet opposition across their western border. They became a source of concern for the Soviet authorities themselves, because speaking of themselves as loyal patriots, they made certain claims of the authorities as loyal and engaged members of society. Just maybe to give you an example, to make this a bit less abstract, there are many Polish tourists visiting Lviv in the beginning of the 1980s. And some of the local inhabitants really resent that, because these Polish visitors sometimes get drunk, and when they're drunk, they sometimes claim that Lviv should be a Polish city. They engage in smuggling and currency speculation. Local population begin to write letters of complaint to the authorities saying, why don't you stop the inflow of such people who are disturbing the peace and stability of this region? And the authorities find themselves at a loss about how to react to this, because they still want to maintain good diplomatic relations with Socialist Poland. To offer you another example, there are major supply problems in Soviet Ukraine during the early 1980s, throughout the Republic. People begin to criticize the authorities by saying, I am a loyal Soviet patriot. My father fought in the Great Patriotic War, as they would put it. I definitely condemn the strikes that are taking place in Poland. And as such a loyal citizen, I want to obtain more reliable information in the press about what's happening in the world, and I want there to be more sausage in my local store. And these kinds of complaints are phrased as loyal criticism, and the Soviet authorities really don't know what to do with that, because they cannot label this dissent, they cannot arrest these people, and yet they cannot really satisfy their demands. So that's one thing I really found very surprising, that expressions of Soviet patriotism were challenging to the authorities. Another thing I found surprising was just how important Ukraine was in Soviet cultural and public diplomacy. During the Czechoslovak crisis in 1968, for example, it is Ukrainian institutions, the Ukrainian Communist Party, which is, of course, a part of the Soviet Communist Party, but it's an autonomous part within it. It's the Ukrainian Writers' Union. It's the Ukrainian communists from the western regions of Ukraine who are tasked with traveling to Czechoslovakia, speaking to Czechoslovak citizens about what's happening, and reporting back on what's happening in Czechoslovakia when they return to the Soviet Union. It is often Ukrainian singers or performers who are traveling to Eastern Europe to represent the Soviet Union there. The idea is that sending Ukrainian actors, Ukrainian singers across the border will prove to East Europeans that the Soviet Union is tolerant of ethnic diversity. So this is a very important aspect of Soviet cultural diplomacy. So I was really surprised by just how important Ukraine and Ukrainian culture was in Soviet foreign policy. So the first thing I would say is fairly, I'm not sure how interesting it is to people interested necessarily in the history of Ukraine, but I think it's a very interesting conclusion for anyone interested in the history of the Soviet Union and the Soviet revolutionary project. Of course, the USSR was founded as a revolutionary state, and in the first years after the revolution, in the 1920s especially, class identities and the idea of internationalism was supposed to overshadow the importance of national identities and the importance of state borders. This is not to say that the Soviet state didn't promote ethnic identities. It did. But the idea was that the revolution would spread across borders and that political loyalty was really to communism and to this idea of international revolution rather than to any particular nation or any particular ethnic group. In the 1930s, the importance of internationalism in the Soviet Union waned. Stalin famously promoted more geographically defined and ethnically defined identities. And in 1944, symbolically, he dropped the Internationale as the unofficial anthem of the Soviet Union. But just as he did that, the Soviet-style socialism spread across borders into Eastern Europe. And this, especially after the death of Stalin, provided a new impetus for Soviet internationalism. In the late 1950s and in the early 1960s, Soviet leaders under Khrushchev's leadership really tried to promote the idea that national identities and state borders were becoming less and less important. But they faced massive opposition to this, not only from certain groups of dissidents who promoted strong national identities, but from people who identified themselves as loyal Soviet citizens. So we have a situation where the Communist Party leadership is promoting an internationalist idea, but on a popular level, it really does not sink in. The Hungarian uprising of 1956 and then the Prague Spring of 1968 convince the majority of Soviet citizens that socialism does not spread across borders, that ethnic identities are there and that they are there to stay, and that state borders, including the borders between socialist countries, are extremely important. So, to sum up, on one level, my book is an attempt, or my book shows that the Soviet leaders take the idea of internationalism seriously, but that they really fail in spreading that idea on a more popular level. My second conclusion would be to say that contrary to what my second conclusion would concern the nature of the Soviet Union as an empire. We know that the Soviet Union did not treat its ethnic groups equally. We know that non-titular ethnic groups that did not have their own ethnically designated republics in the Soviet Union, such as Jews, for instance, or Crimean Tatars, that they really found it very difficult to register their grievances as citizens. They were really second or even third-class citizens of the Soviet Union. We also know that non-Russian republics, including Ukraine, were subject to Russification and Moscow's political dominance. And this is all true. If we just look at the developments within the USSR itself, we see certain imperial practices and imperial ideologies. But when we look at the outer empire in Eastern Europe, a different picture emerges. My conclusion is that in dialogue and in confrontation with Eastern Europe, Soviet Ukraine emerged as part of the Soviet imperial center. Soviet Ukraine and Ukrainian culture was part of the Soviet culture, and it was part of the imperial culture, and Eastern Europe was the imperial periphery. My third conclusion concerns notions of citizenship in the Soviet Union. We tend to think of the late 1950s and the early 1960s as a time when Soviet citizens really engaged in debate about their country's past and their country's future. This is because Khrushchev allowed for some degree of controlled debate. We tend to think of the 1970s and the 1980s as a period of stagnation, when most people lost faith in the communist project and therefore no longer engaged in any meaningful political debates. They kept their heads low. There were, of course, some dissidents who really risked a lot, including their lives, to express what they really thought, but most people, not really believing the party anymore, just got on with it. They engaged in the second economy and they tried to make the best life they could. What I find in my book is that citizens of the USSR and inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine in particular engage in lively political debate as late as the 1970s and the 1980s. And this is not because they believe in communism. This is not because they believe in the party's pronouncements about a brighter socialist future. Rather, it is because ethnically and geographically defined identities, a sort of Soviet Ukrainian patriotism, proved to be very effective means of political mobilization. So people really care about the state because they see the Soviet state as representing their interests as Ukrainians. And they see the Soviet state as representing their interests as Soviet citizens, and not because they believe in the building of communism. When I traveled to Kiev in 2014, I went to the Maidan straight away to see what was happening there. And I saw two large posters, banners overlooking the Maidan. One was of Stepan Bandera and the other one was of Vyacheslav Chornovil. Bandera, to me, symbolized a particular vision of Ukrainianness, which I saw in my own research in 20th century Ukraine. Ukrainianness defined against the Soviet Union in no uncertain terms. People who chose Bandera as their symbol, whether in the USSR or now, saw the Soviet Union as a foreign force in Ukraine. So they existed, and I traced their history. Chornovil, to me, symbolized a very different vision of Ukrainianness, a vision of Ukrainianness grounded in what I describe in the book as Soviet reformist patriotism. I write about inhabitants of Ukraine who were very critical of authoritarianism, who were very much longing for a more open public sphere in Soviet Ukraine, but who had much more ambiguous attitudes towards the Soviet project. Just as Chornovil, who in the late 1980s, leading Ruch, is calling for very far-reaching reform, but in the early stages is not actually questioning the territorial integrity of the Soviet Union. He's looking for reform within the USSR. And this vision of Ukrainianness, symbolized in 2014 by the poster of Chornovil and expressed through the means of Soviet reformist patriotism in the second half of the 20th century, I think was much more widespread than the Bandera vision of Ukraine. It was much less ethnocentric. So even though Soviet reformist patriots talked about Ukrainian national rights and the dangers of Russification, they also spoke about the rights of the Jewish population of Ukraine, or about the rights of the Crimean Tatars and their right to return. In other words, they saw themselves as advocates for all inhabitants of Ukraine and not just one particular ethnic group. So I trace their history, and I think there are important parallels to be drawn between the Maidan protests and what I call reformist patriotism. And I cannot express this in full right now, but I would invite you to read the book to see what those parallels might be. But I remember also in 2014 leaving the Maidan and going to my friend's apartment not very far away, on Red Army Street, which I know is not the official name of the street, but it's still the name that everyone uses, which is in itself quite telling. And I couldn't sleep because I heard the neighbours arguing across the wall. And I gathered from the conversation that it was a mother and a daughter, and that the daughter was old enough to have her own children. And the daughter was clearly pro-Maidan. And she kept saying, we are Ukrainian, we have to support this movement, and your president, Yanukovych, for whom you voted, he's to blame, and he betrayed the Ukrainian people. The mother, on the other hand, was panicking. And she was saying, she was accusing her daughter of playing fast and loose with her children's future. She was saying, our future lies with Russia because the West has no good intentions towards us. And she represented the legacies of what I in the book call conservative patriotism. This conservative patriotism may be mistaken in many of its assumptions, but it needs to be taken seriously because it has very deep roots in Ukraine among self-identified Ukrainians. These people are not simply manipulated by Russian propaganda today. These people are not simply passive victims. They are passive victims of media manipulation. Rather, they build on the legacies of what I in the book call Soviet conservative patriotism. Soviet conservative patriotism was an ideology that was espoused by many Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians. It was an ideology that did not preclude people from being active citizens. People were conservative patriots, and yet they criticized the state, and they went out and protested against what they didn't like. And just mirroring those patterns from the Soviet period, people who cling on to this vision of Ukrainianness people who cling on to the vision of Ukraine as a country that needs to remain in a very close alliance with Russia are still citizens who are prepared to stand up for what they believe. And that's why I think we need to take them seriously rather than dismissing them as simply being duped by Russian propaganda. I'm not trying to say that we should simply give in and say, okay, well, if these people think that, then we should just accept it. I think we need to acknowledge that these views are deeply rooted in order to find ways of arguing against them. And we also need to acknowledge that we need to understand where these views are rooted in order to know how to fight against these views. So I would say, for instance, that notions of Soviet conservative patriotism that I think a lot of inhabitants of Ukraine still espouse today, they are not only about loyalty to Russia. They are also underpinned by the belief that citizens have the right to access information, that loyal citizens have the right to live in prosperity. This is what advocates of Soviet conservative patriotism claimed back in the USSR. And I think there are ways of selling reform, of showing how moving away from Soviet practices and Soviet post-Soviet international relations can help to realize some of the demands that loyal Soviet citizens had been voicing back in the 1970s and the 1980s. So I think what is inspiring perhaps about this book is that we see that even the people who were staunch Soviet patriots, who were not supportive of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and who believe that Russians and Ukrainians are quote-unquote brothers who are destined to be together forever, that these people espouse views that the Maidan represents today. That they espouse certain, let me rephrase that they believe in the importance of citizenship. And I think that they can be reached because of that. I have one concern. I have one concern because I've noticed that when I speak about this project, there's often a lot of confusion about what Eastern Europe actually is and how it's different from Ukraine. I mentioned that I had to revise many assumptions about the project that I made back in 2005, 2006. But there's one assumption that I didn't end up revising, and that is the fact that Eastern Europe, the Soviet satellite states bordering on Ukraine to the west, were a very important point of reference for inhabitants of Ukraine who are arguing about who they actually were and what their country should be. And this is because Eastern Europe was a sort of Soviet near abroad. It was both much more familiar than the capitalist West, and yet it was also unambiguously foreign. So it was familiar because travel to Eastern Europe, from the perspective of a Soviet citizen, was much easier than travel to the capitalist West. It was more familiar because mass media from Eastern Europe could be legally obtained. Let's say Polish or Czechoslovak newspapers could be bought in Soviet Ukraine. These countries were familiar because they were also, at least nominally, socialist. They were allies of the USSR. But they were foreign because you still needed to get a foreign passport and a special permit to travel there, because Russian was not nearly as widely spoken in this East European near abroad as it was in the USSR itself. And they were unambiguously foreign because they faced types of mass opposition that was not seen in the USSR itself. Their policies diverged from Moscow's policies. Censorship was more lax in those countries, and repression was less severe in Eastern Europe than it was in the USSR. That's why the near abroad was both familiar and foreign. And this not quite foreign status of the Soviet satellite states raised troubling questions amongst inhabitants of Ukraine. If the Czechs are relaxing censorship, should we do the same or not? If the Poles are claiming more cultural autonomy from Moscow and promoting more Polish culture from the 19th century, should Ukrainians be allowed to do the same or not? In other words, by observing and interacting with the East European near abroad, Soviet citizens in Ukraine questioned not only Soviet foreign policy in those countries, but also the nature of the system in which they themselves lived.